Alrighty guys, we'll get started. Hopefully. See how we go. There's a few glitches on this system today. So we'll just see how it all plays out. It keeps turning itself off at the moment. Okay, so second last lecture of content for the semester. How did we get here so fast? Anyway, we are here. We're going to do climate change today. Look, I'm as shocked as you guys are. I'm like, what? Week 11? How did that happen? So we do climate change this week. Next week, we do a really important lecture talking about ethical obligations and professional duties and looking at the conflicts that arise, particularly in consultancy work. And so we look at a few case studies next week looking at coal seam gas and other sort of fairly controversial topics. This week we do climate change, and then the final lecture, week 13, it's going to be a Q&A session. So I won't have anything prepared so much. I'll pick a few slides from each week, from each of the lectures, each of the topics, and I'll sort of put them up, and you can come along, and any questions that you have on each of the topics, things that you want clarified or anything like that, you can ask in that Q&A session in week 13. So it'll be a bit of a sort of community revision session. Great questions I've been asked this week. I have been asked a really good question. Someone had picked up on the fact that the last few weeks I've had shorter lectures. And they were saying, well, why is that? And it's a very good reason for it. It's a deliberate design that I've put into the course. I'm one of those people that doesn't believe in talking for the sake of it. So my feeling is, unless I'm talking about something you need to know for the assessment, there's no need for me to go on for an extra half an hour if I have no intention of assessing you on, that particular topic. And one of the things that I saw when I looked at the course was that in those weeks that we've just had, so weeks 7 to 10, you had 6 topics that you had to cover. So in addition to the Environmental Protection Act and the EPBC Act, there were 4 other topics that were included in those lectures. And it just seemed too crammed for the course content. And so I took those extra 4 topics out, and I decided we were better off having 2 shorter lectures on the Environmental Protection Act that gave you more time to think about the key components and then come back to them in the second lecture. And then I did the same thing with the EPBC Act, 2 shorter lectures where we came back and we revisited some of the key concepts in that second lecture. So for those of you that were wondering, that was the reason why they were shorter lectures. So I saw a really quite a cool article that someone had put up on Facebook during the week, and I've just put it up there in your slides. It's this idea of purposeful study, this idea that rather than just sitting down and randomly studying for an exam, that you do it with real purpose and real strategy. And they did this research at Stanford that found that they were able to increase everyone's marks by about 1/3 of a grade, they were saying. So they were able to get them from sort of a B+ to an A just by getting them to sit down and think purposefully about how they were going to study for the exam. What sort of mark did they want? What resources were they going to use to get themselves there? Were they going to make sure that they went to the lectures, make sure their lecture notes were really cool? Were they going to have peer discussion groups? Were they going to go through the past exam papers, and so on and so forth? And they found that those that sat down and thought about it strategically, regardless of their grades beforehand, ended up getting a better mark at the end. So I figured it wouldn't hurt. So it's in the slides, so there you go. So here we are, week 11. So we're going to do lecture 11, legal responses to climate change. Most of you did the 2012 practice exam this week. I've just got 1 postgrad session left to go after this lecture. Next week, we'll do the professional duties lecture, and in the prac next week, you'll look at the Land Access Code, and you're going to look at it specifically from the point of view of building up your skills in critical thinking and insight, which is what you need to get those extra marks in the exam. And then in week 13, we're going to do the 2014 past exam, and we'll start with the essay question and work our way back through the papers. So that's pretty much the aim of the game between now and the end of semester. So, you know, a word of warning before I start talking about climate change. It's a bit of a pet topic for me. I did my PhD and my postdoc looking at essentially regulatory responses to climate change. And so the PhD was looking at this idea of how do we look at the interactions between regulatory and market and liability provisions. And then I sort of expanded that in the postdoc to the textbook that I wrote called Legal Responses to Climate Change, which is, you know, was groundbreaking at the time. No one else was doing it, mostly because it was too complicated. And I still live in fear of the editor coming back and asking me to update the book because a lot has changed since I wrote it. The aim of today is to really give you a bit of an overview about how to think about climate change from that point of view of critical thinking again. So it's not just about the data on climate change, it's not just about the impacts on climate change, it's about what does that mean when we talk about regulatory frameworks. What does that mean when we talk about changing current behaviours and current practices? And so if everyone can walk away from the lecture today having a better approach to critical thinking about it, then I think it's a really useful skill to have. So I'm going to start by giving everyone an overview on the science of climate change because not everybody has looked into it, and we sort of need to make sure everyone's coming to it at a level playing field. If you know all this stuff, just bear with me, and we'll get to the details as we go along. So for people who don't know, this is an image of what the greenhouse effect looks like, you know, why we have this thing called global warming. In the early days, that's what it was called. It was called the greenhouse effect. It was called global warming. You notice we don't talk about that so much now. Now we talk about it from the point of view of climate change because it's the impacts of this global warming that is important. But for a long time, there was question marks over whether, in fact, this thing known as the greenhouse effect was really occurring. And this just gives you an idea. So we've got heat from the sun, the solar radiation. We have some of it coming down through the blanket of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And what happens is that's getting trapped down on the Earth's surfaces. People describe it a bit like having a warm blanket over you at night. It traps that warm heat underneath, and it stops it from escaping back into the atmosphere. So what that means is the area underneath continues to warm up, and that's why we call it global warming. That's really where it all comes from. So that's just to give you an idea of why we keep talking about greenhouse gases in those sort of contexts. Is the climate changing? Well, these quotes are taken from 2006, 2007, which really is quite a long time ago. And even then, the IPCC was saying, and that was for the first time in 2007, the IPCC finally concluded that warming of the climate system was unequivocal. Up until that point, the scientific evidence didn't have the consensus of the IPCC scientific community. And so they were saying things like it's highly likely, you know, and so on and so forth, but there was still a certain amount of disagreement amongst the IPCC scientists about whether, in fact, the climate system was warming. So 2007 was really pivotal because that was the first time we had an assessment report coming out saying that warming of the climate system was unequivocal. And then we had Australia's own State of the Environment report, 2006, saying climate change is undoubtedly a threat to Australia's environment. And again, that was the first time we had seen a public document, because although it's an independent committee that writes that report, it's still an Australian government publication, and that was the first time we had seen an Australian government publication dare to say that climate change was a threat to Australia. And you see, they don't just say that it's a threat, it's undoubtedly a threat. So again, there was consensus in the scientific community behind that State of the Environment report saying that climate change was a threat. So these were very controversial points at the time. I was doing a yeehaw when these reports came out because they were great for the PhD. They really marked a turning point in terms of the public dialogue, particularly overseas. Let's all admit Australia's been a bit slow on the uptake, but nevertheless, they still have had an impact. So again, that 2007 report also said for the first time that increase in temperatures were very likely caused by anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. So that means greenhouse gas concentrations released from human activities. That's what anthropogenic means. And they also said that surface temperatures were likely to rise by 1.8 to 4 degrees Celsius by 2099. Again, this was the first time we were seeing more confidence and much more obvious conclusions, you know, very likely, and it really did change things in terms of people sitting up and wondering about it. So what did these reports say were going to happen to Australia? Well, they talked about the impacts of climate change globally, and they also talked about the impacts of climate change specifically in Australia. And this was the IPCC writing about this, not the Australian government. So physical impacts of climate change, we're going to see temperature extremes, rising sea levels. We're going to see increased precipitation, so increased rainfall, but also increased drought, more extreme weather events, so storms, floods, high winds, increase in disease, so more aeroallergens, and a decrease in water quality. There's going to be property damage, and we'll talk about that more a little later on in the lecture, but also up to 200 million people could be displaced. I was one of the first people that tracked down a quote from the 1990s. The Australian government had engaged the CSIRO to do a study on the cost to Australia of reducing emissions versus the cost of relocating vulnerable people in low-lying island states. And someone from the CSIRO was quoted as saying that it was cheaper for Australia to relocate communities from low-lying island states than it was to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And I tracked down this quote and I threw it into my PhD, and you know, it's a brilliant example of, you know, maths gone wrong when you think it's cheaper to allow these low-lying states to flood. But rather unfortunately, there were a lot of footnotes in my PhD, and I got the page number wrong. And it's been nicked by so many people ever since, and I know people have nicked my work because they're still using the wrong page number. So they haven't gone and found it themselves, and they're still using my footnote. And obviously, they haven't worked out what I have, which is it's the wrong page. But anyway, these are the things that happen when you've got 100,000 words in a PhD. So, what did the IPCC say? It said warming of the climate system is unequivocal, as is now evident from observations of increases in global average air and ocean temperatures, widespread melting of snow and ice, and rising global average sea level. At continental, regional, and ocean basin scales, numerous long-term changes in climate have been observed. These include changes in Arctic temperatures and ice, widespread changes in precipitation amounts, ocean salinity, wind patterns, and aspects of extreme weather, including droughts, heavy precipitation, heat waves, and the intensity of tropical cyclones. So what does that mean? Those more extreme temperatures are going to mean increases in surface and ocean temperatures, decreases in snow cover, permafrost and ice, and sea level rises. The changes in the wind patterns are going to mean more intense storms and cyclones, and the changes in precipitation patterns are going to see increases in drought as well as increases in flooding. So these are the general global impacts that we're going to see across various geographic regions. But we're also going to see impacts such as the loss of ecosystem biodiversity, so particular sensitive areas like the Great Barrier Reef and the wet tropics. We're going to see shifts in marine organisms and fishery zones, shifts in migratory species, provided that they have available habitat to shift to, and if there isn't any availability of habitat for those migratory shifts, then we're going to see species loss from those migratory species. We're also going to see things like changes in the spread of infectious diseases. Particular diseases that are only prevalent in particularly hot climates, we're going to see those diseases spread as a result of these warming temperatures, which means we're at increased risk of epidemics. And the same goes for increased risk from waterborne infection. And there's been well documented the health impacts that we're going to start seeing in terms of increases in aeroallergens, thermal stress, and deaths from extreme weather events. And there are some fairly harrowing reports out there that have been done about the number of deaths that we're already seeing over in Europe, for example, when we get those heat waves during the summer, because a lot of those areas are not designed for hot temperatures. They're very insulated. They're designed to keep the houses warm. We see a lot of elderly people dying routinely now each time that we have these heat waves over in Europe, partly because of building design and just partly because of a lack of education of what to do during those times of heat stress. We're going to see inundation of low-lying islands, which apparently is not a problem for Australia. Inundation of coastal zones, intensified by high tides, storm surges and coastal erosion. Decreases in soil moisture, reductions in food production and agricultural yields, and population displacement. So those increases in heat waves, we've got increases in bushfires, changes in water availability, which is going to be something that Australia is going to become particularly sensitive to, loss and damage to public infrastructure, homes, livestock and property, and that's from a number of areas: storms, flooding, erosion, landslides, bushfires, loss of business assets and disruptions in the supply chain. One of the things that they've realised very recently is that the electricity transmission lines aren't designed to be able to withstand particularly high temperatures, that there's components that are made up of those electricity transmission lines that are going to melt above a certain temperature. And we've already had examples over, again, in Europe where these places were not designed for high temperatures, where we've had instances where the tar on the roads has begun to melt and just become sticky goo during the summer heat waves, because the design parameters that were followed when they laid down the tar, they weren't expecting these sort of heat waves that we're currently experiencing. So what specifically are we going to see in terms of impacts in Australia? Again, this has come from the IPCC 2007 report. So they were pointing to Australia and saying, this is what you will face. And they said heat waves and fires are virtually certain to increase in intensity and frequency. Floods, landslides, drought and storm surges are very likely to become more frequent, more intense. Snow and frost are very likely to become less frequent, and large areas of mainland Australia are likely to have less soil moisture. It says, as a result of reduced precipitation and increased evaporation, water security problems are projected to intensify by 2030 in southern and eastern Australia. And of course, we already know that water availability and water security is an area of real sensitivity for Australia, those are all going to intensify, which is why when we talk about coal seam gas and we talk about potential impacts on groundwater systems, these issues become even more significant. And the other thing they pointed out is that ongoing coastal development and population growth is projected to exacerbate risks from sea level rise and increases in the severity and frequency of storms and coastal flooding by 2050. Now, you all looked at this in your group assignments, the difficulties that we have with so much development along our coasts, and that's predicted to get worse. We are predicted to have even more development along our coasts, not less. But at the same time, sea level rise, storm surges and erosion are going to increase, and so we're going to have this clash, and it's going to have implications and impacts across Australia. We're going to see risks to major infrastructure that are likely to increase, and the IPCC at that time was saying that by 2030, design criteria for extreme events are very likely to be exceeded more frequently. And they highlighted some of the risks that we would see to our infrastructure in Australia. So failure of floodplain protection and urban drainage and sewerage, increased storm and fire damage, and more heat waves causing more deaths and more blackouts. They pointed out that production from our agriculture and forestry was projected to decline by 2030 over most of southern and eastern Australia, and again warned that a significant loss of biodiversity is projected to occur by 2020 in some ecologically rich sites, including the Great Barrier Reef and Queensland wet tropics. So you can see Australia was very much put on notice about the importance of responding to climate change and about the importance of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and this was a decade ago. This was 2007. One of the questions that often comes up when I give presentations to industry and legal firms and government and all the rest of it, it comes up, how reliable is the science? And there's many ways of answering that, but the way that I found is the most, the most effective is to not answer it in terms of how reliable is the science, but to point out to them how conservative the IPCC estimates are. To actually point out to them the number of things that have been excluded from the IPCC estimations, their predictions. So the IPCC points out that there are a range of things which may increase the effects of climate change, which they have not included in their predictions because of question marks and because of a lack of scientific consensus around them. Things like abrupt changes in ocean circulation patterns, including changes in the Gulf Stream, significant increases in methane emissions from the melting permafrost, significant and sudden sea level rises from the breakup of polar ice caps, and what we call other feedback responses. And there was a report done in 2009, it was called Faster Change and More Serious Risks by Will Stephan. So it was an Australian Government Department of Climate Change report. And what it showed, so the yellow bar there is the model projections from the IPCC third and fourth assessment reports. And then the red bar above it is additional contributions from potential ice sheet dynamic processes. And then the red arrow pointing up says next to it, larger values cannot be excluded. So they're highlighting there the impact that we can see in terms of sea level rise and coastal sea level impacts when you start taking into account some of those matters that the IPCC did not include in its predictions in the third and fourth assessment reports. So what should we do to deal with this scientific uncertainty? Now, you'll remember that one of the tools, if you like, in ecologically sustainable development is the tool of the precautionary principle. So the precautionary principle is designed to allow decision makers to address the presence of scientific uncertainty when there is a threat of serious or irreversible harm to the environment. And the precautionary principle is clear that the presence of scientific uncertainty should not be a reason for failing to act when there is a threat of serious or irreversible harm to the environment. So in a case like this, the precautionary principle would tell us that greenhouse gas emissions should cease or decline in the face of that scientific uncertainty. So until such time as we were sure that the emission of greenhouse gases was not causing irreversible environmental harm, then we would not permit greenhouse gases to be emitted. It's a very straightforward use of the precautionary principle. It's what it was designed for. But it goes in circles because we then have people pointing to the number of scientific reports that show that the climate is not warming and greenhouse gas emissions are not responsible and so on and so forth, and they try and use that to argue that there is no scientific uncertainty here. But from a very theoretical point of view, that's what the precautionary principle is designed to do, is to stop us carrying out actions that will harm the environment until such time as we have all the scientific evidence that we need to know that we can do it without causing irreversible harm to the environment. One of the great arguments that comes up in terms of public policy is what will be the costs of responding to climate change versus what will be the costs of allowing unmitigated climate change. And this really was the real core focus of the Australian policy response for many, many years. Australia adopted what it called the no regrets policy of responding to greenhouse gas emissions. So it said it would only reduce greenhouse gas emissions if there was either a net benefit to Australia from doing so or no net cost to Australia from doing so. And so because of that, even now to this day, whenever we talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in that same dialogue, we talk about what will it cost versus what are the economic benefits to Australia from reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And there was a report done back in 2006 known as the Stern Review, where for the first time someone stepped up and said, okay, well, let's do the economics. Let's look at the economics to Australia of either allowing greenhouse gas emissions to go unmitigated or proceeding to reduce emissions and minimise these risks that we see from climate change. And the Stern Review, one of the greatest quotes to come out of it is they said that climate change is the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. And I thoroughly agree with that. It's an excellent quote and it's very accurate. So climate change is the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. And we'll have a bit of a chat about the Stern Review. He had some wonderful things to say in his report. So he pointed out the stocks of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are rising, and this is driven by increasing emissions from human activities, including energy generation and land use change. Okay, so that was quite a bold statement there. Even then, Australia was still trying to argue that anthropogenic activities, so human-driven activities, were not leading to increases in atmospheric emissions or increases in global warming. And he made an estimate then that the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere would be around, were about 430 parts per million carbon dioxide equivalent, currently rising at roughly 2.5 parts per million every year. Now, our greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in Australia, pretty much peaked in 2005, 2006 were when they were at their worst, and then we started seeing a decline. So this is pretty much where we're up to at the moment. This was from December 2016. So we were about 404 parts per million. So this is the Keeling curve. This is what everyone points to look at the fact that, you know, our carbon dioxide concentrations are increasing over time, and that if we continue on current trends, they'll just continue to increase and increase and increase. So this idea that you know, they're not all being absorbed into the trees and the vegetation and the seas, that they are in fact accumulating and accumulating at a much higher rate than we first thought. And this was the record that started to show sort of accurate data, if you like, on the fact that there were in fact concentrations of these in the atmosphere that were increasing, and were increasing much larger than people had first thought. And in fact, in May 2016, we had for the first time Cape Grim, which is well known for its incredibly clear air readings, so it's got incredibly clean air around it, and it's started recording carbon dioxide levels there in excess of 400 parts per million. I think it dipped slightly after May 2016, but even so, it was enough for everyone to sit up and take some notice. So where are the emissions coming from? Well, this is from the Stern Review. Again, it's 2006, but it shows you where these emissions are coming from across the different sectors. You can see the power sector is about 24%. We've got industry, 14%. Transport, another 14%. Land use, agriculture, about 18% and 14%. And so you can get a real feel there for where the different emissions are, and where the primary issues are in terms of trying to design a regulatory response for them. So the Stern Review said, even if annual greenhouse gas emissions remained at the current level of 42 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent every year, the world would experience major climate change. That rate of emissions would be sufficient to take greenhouse gas concentrations to over 650 parts per million carbon dioxide equivalent by the end of the century, likely to result eventually in a rise in the global mean temperature of at least 3 degrees Celsius from its pre-industrial level. Okay, he said, so that was even if emissions remained at current levels. So even if we didn't increase what we were emitting into the atmosphere, we would still experience major climate change. And then he started looking at the costs, and he said, well, up to 200 million people could become displaced by the middle of the century due to climatic impacts. And he said that the economic cost of warming of that 2 to 3 degrees Celsius was predicted to be 3% of global world output. So he was trying very clearly to put a dollar sign for the Australian government on what the cost will be to Australia's economy and to the world economy, because of course Australia is dependent on the world economy as much as it is on its own economy, and wanted there to be this dollar sign that would act as a signal to the Australian government to take the policy measures that needed to be taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. He said there was at least a 77% chance and up to a 99% chance of a global average temperature rise exceeding 2 degrees Celsius. That 2 degrees at the time was because under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was what in place at the time, dangerous anthropogenic climate change was considered to be a rise of between 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. So he was pointing out that we would be in breach of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change if we allowed those unmitigated emissions to continue. And then he went on to try and put a dollar figure on what would happen if we saw, for example, worst case scenario of 5 to 6 degrees Celsius warming. He said that cost could be up to 10% of global gross domestic product and could involve reductions of up to 20% in consumption per head, which are significant economic figures. So again, it's all about that idea of where does the cost fall. And the Garneau Review in 2011, the Garneau Climate Change Review, did a similar exercise. So this graph here is showing you the modelled expected market costs for Australia of unmitigated climate change from 2013 to 2100. And what you're seeing there, that orange is real GMP, the blue is real GDP, and it's showing a decline in those over time. So the market costs over time from unmitigated climate change. So the Stern Review said to stabilise emissions at 550 parts per million, so 550 ppm, would require global emissions to peak in the next 10 to 20 years and then fall at a rate of at least 1 to 3% per year. And by 2050, global emissions would need to be around 25% below current levels. He said delaying the peak in global emissions from 2020 to 2030 would almost double the rate of reduction needed to stabilise at 550 parts per million. So he was trying to show the difference in cost and the difference in effort for Australia between acting now versus acting later. So acting now would have meant that the mitigation activity would have been easier, and it also would have been more cost effective. And he went on to describe some of the benefits that would happen if we acted earlier too. But first he set out the cost. So he said the annual cost of emission reductions, consistent with a trajectory leading to stabilisation at 550 parts per million, would be approximately 1% of GDP by 2050. And he compared that to the social cost of carbon emitted today. So this was back in 2006, 2007. If society remained on the business as usual trajectory, it was estimated to be approximately US $85 per tonne of carbon dioxide. And so that was the social cost of allowing each tonne of emissions to continue to be emitted into the atmosphere. And again, the Garneau Climate Change Review did a very similar exercise. So what they were showing here, so you'll see midway along the orange line, there's an arrow pointing up. That's the net cost to GNP growth from reducing mitigation. So early on there was a cost of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and then you go further along the line and you see a drop, and that's the net benefits to GNP growth from greenhouse gas emissions being mitigated. So there's a cost early on, but then there's a benefit that's returned to the economy later from undertaking those mitigation costs. And then again, this is the Garneau Climate Change Review looking at the sectoral growth rate. So it's looking at agriculture, mining, manufacture, services, so the different sectors, looking at their growth rates compared to the net mitigation costs. And basically showing that all of them survived the temporary bump of having to modify practices and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see none of them slump down into the ground and don't recover. They all eventually regain and continue to experience growth. And that includes the mining sector, so agriculture, mining, manufacturing, services sectors. So Stern was one of the few reports that tried really hard to show the Australian government the economic benefits from being an early mover in climate change. And did so by putting dollar figures on what would happen if they were one of the first ones to start investing in and developing commercial scale mitigation measures, so renewable energy and energy efficiency measures and all those things we talk about now. If they'd done it then, what would be the economic benefits to them? So he said shifting to a lower emissions trajectory would have global net benefits of around US $2.5 trillion, not million, not billion, $1 trillion, that markets for low carbon energy products were likely to be worth at least US $500 billion per year by 2050. And he went on to say, in this sense, mitigation is a highly productive investment. So you can see there was a real purpose behind the Stern Review, and that purpose was to try and talk to the Australian government using its own terminology, using its own language of no regrets policy. You know, we won't reduce emissions unless there is a net benefit to Australia and no net cost. And so he was attempting very strategically to talk in that same language and to address those concerns. Now he did point out that certain generalizations had to be made in order to reach those figures. No one really knew what the market in low carbon products was going to look like in 2050, so he had to make certain educated guesses. And this is how he described it, and I did feel like he put it very eloquently. He said, economic forecasting over just a few years is a difficult and imprecise task. The analysis of climate change requires, by its nature, that we look out over 50, 100, 200 years and more. Any such modelling requires caution and humility, and the results are specific to the model and its assumptions. They should not be endowed with a precision and certainty that is simply impossible to achieve. Further, some of the big uncertainties in the science and the economics concern the areas we know least about. For example, the impacts of very high temperatures. So he was warning, really, that what he had done was not a perfect science, it was not a perfect tool, and that he wasn't holding himself out as having delivered a perfect model. He was just trying to deliver something that would help in that decision-making process. So, knowing what we know now about those impacts of climate change, this is the critical thinking part. This is where you sit and you think, well, okay, when I go out and I'm working as a consultant, or whatever, cool job I'm doing, how will my knowledge of climate change influence the advice that I give? How will my knowledge of climate change influence the reports that I do and the work that I do? And when I used to start giving these talks, it just wasn't in people's dialogue. People were not considering climate change when they talked to their clients. They weren't saying to them, have you thought about the impacts of sea level rise on your port that you are now building? Have you thought about the impacts of more severe storms and bushfires on this infrastructure that you're putting out in the middle of the bush? Have you thought about, taking into account high temperature extremes when you're designing your buildings? Now, that's different now. We do see that much more present in people's dialogue, this idea of future predictions and looking at adaptability and resilience in our design and our location. But we still can go a lot further, and that's why it's really important to keep in mind the sort of things that we're talking about today. So what will be the impacts on businesses? Well, first of all, there's the physical impacts. So these rising sea levels are going to impact ports, warehouses, and all other properties that are located in those lower lying areas. We've seen discussion in the media quite recently about how BP and other oil companies have been carrying out their own sea level rise predictions for many, many, many years to work out how their drilling infrastructure and other areas in low-lying areas are going to be impacted by future climate change. And in fact, over in the US, they've subpoenaed that information, and they're trying to use it to prove that the big oil and gas giants have known all along that climate change was real, because they have taken steps themselves to modify the designs of their drilling platforms and their ports and all other areas which are susceptible to climate change, which means that they must have acknowledged that climate change was a real threat in order to incorporate that into their design. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But certainly, we're already seeing, just in Brisbane, we see these severe weather events come through, and we see the sheer cost, the economic cost of damaging buildings, equipment, infrastructure. You get power outages, and you get both a loss of production, but also a loss of data that goes with that. And all it takes is one part of the supply chain to go down for the entire business to suffer massive economic impacts from the loss of the continuous supply chain. I won't go into detail, and the other ones are much more a legal sort of thing, if only to point out that shareholder accountability is certainly becoming much more prevalent now, and we're seeing a lot more vocal responses from shareholders who are demanding that their investments move away from investing in coal mines or investing in things that are considered to be greenhouse gas intensive, and moving instead towards the future of renewables and clean energy and so on. And we've again seen reports over the last 12 months pointing out that it's only a matter of time before directors of companies start being sued in Australia for failing to take into account the risks of climate change in their investment decisions. It's something I wrote about in my PhD, if they'd read it, but yeah, it is only a matter of time, and it certainly will happen. Building and construction. So many things that need to be taken into account in building and construction. Heat stress is a big one. Choice of building materials that are able to take into account that future heat stress. choice of location, the stability of foundations. We find that in times of drought, we end up with instability in those foundations, and then the floods come through and we end up undermining the foundations of these buildings. And we're also seeing a huge change in terms of this idea of green ratings. That's also quite a new concept, this idea that a building would have a green star rating, or that it would be in some way sustainable or less energy intensive. And that has an impact on its property value. And, you know, this has been an area that the building and construction industry has really embraced, of realizing that their properties are worth more on the market if they can say that it is green star rated, so it's got some sort of sustainability ranking, so it's got thermal insulation, it's got water efficiency measures, energy efficiency measures, and the number of stars keep going up in terms of what we see as, you know, the best case outcome and so on. And that's been really interesting, watching that change. Other things to keep into account are things like energy supply issues. You know, are we building our houses to be resilient to changes in where our energy comes from? You know, should we be seeing more solar and less reliance on traditional electricity? And also more changes in terms of approval requirements that come through that planning assessment process, in terms of, well, what will be the direct greenhouse gas emissions from building this building? What will be the emissions over the life cycle of the building? And in Europe, they also look at things like, well, what happens at the end of life? What happens at the end of life in terms of the emissions that come from demolishing or retrofitting, and all those other things. So it really, again, it gets you thinking differently about how we start designing these areas. Property values. So climate change is going to impact on the valuation of properties. Building design, location, this idea of resilience to climate change is already coming into people's vocab. We're also likely to see greater obligations to disclose to purchasers that areas are subject to flooding, or that areas are at risk. We haven't got that at the moment. It's very much a buyer beware at the moment. It's the buyer has to go and check the flood maps and make an educated guess on whether an area is likely to flood. And that will have to change, I suspect, in order to educate the community about what they're buying into. There's going to be impacts on insurance availability, as well as costs to insure against climate change risks to the asset. There are huge areas in England now that are uninsurable. No insurer will cover the risk of flooding in those areas. They've done the predictions. They've looked at the predicted impacts of climate change. They've looked at the predicted sea level rises, and they've done the maths. They looked at the risk of storm surges, and they've looked at all of the data. This is the insurers, and they have said those areas are uninsurable. And we have areas in Australia that are very close to the same thing. The only reason we still have insurances at the moment is because the government is very heavily involved in making sure that insurers continue to give insurance for flood protection. But that has a cost implication in terms of premiums, and the more of these severe storm events we see, the more this idea of insurance becomes less available to us, because at some point it's no longer cost effective for an insurer to take on the risk of insuring against the impacts of climate change. And so then we start saying, well, if an area is uninsurable, what do we do with it? And so you have all of these wonderful questions about, well, do you retrofit the buildings to try and adapt them to the risk of climate change? Do you relocate the buildings? Do you have this concept of forced retreat, which is what they're trialling in New South Wales? So yes, you can live on this site for now, but your planning approval will expire 15 years from now, 20 years from now, whatever the date is, and on that date, you must retreat from your land. You will no longer be permitted to live in that building, on that land, and it's called forced retreat. And you can imagine the landholders hate it, because these are multi-million-dollar properties on the coast, and they don't want to give them up for this idea of forced retreat. banking and finance is already realising that they need to be very aware of climate change because a lot of them have asset risks. So they're lending out money left, right and centre for various developments, and those assets that they are lending money for are at risk. They're at risk of flooding, they're at risk of storm damage, and the thing that's meant to be protecting their mortgage and their loans could be wiped out because of a storm or because of flooding or because of bushfires. So this, again, is something that the banking and finance industry has become very aware of. Asset risks, litigation risks, realising that directors of companies now could be held accountable for failing to respond to climate change. Understanding that there are going to be impacts on the supply chain, limitations on the ability to insure. And we have this wonderful dilemma that no one really has a good answer to. But should public authorities step in and insure if insurers say that they won't give insurance? Or are we asking insurers to step in and play the role of regulators? So what we're finding overseas is that an insurer will say, yes, we will insure your house, but in return, you have to retrofit, or you have to put in place measures to reduce the risk to your property. So they're basically playing the role of an insurer by going in and trying to change the behaviours of the landholder on the site to minimise the risk of climate change to them. And that really isn't what insurers should be doing. That's meant to be the role of the government. So again, it's a bit of a dilemma. And superannuation isn't going to be left out of this either. They've got product disclosure obligations. They now have fiduciary obligations to consider the impact of climate change on their investment portfolios. And we're seeing more and more people looking closely at their superannuation to ask, how heavily am I investing in mining companies? How heavily is my super dependent on Australia's energy and resources boom? And if so, am I with the right super agency? And again, this is stuff that just wasn't really part of people's day-to-day conversation not that long ago. Energy and resources. We're going to see differences in terms of preferences globally in terms of choice of energy sources and raw materials. There's no doubt there's going to be regulatory changes. It's just a question of when and to what extent. And we're going to see questions of reliability here in terms of energy during extreme temperature events and risks to the electricity infrastructure itself from extreme weather events. And I was mentioning that report where they've identified that the infrastructure itself can't withstand the higher temperatures. It will melt. Tourism, from an Australian point of view, our tourism is quite dependent on this concept of environmental aesthetics. There's going to be impacts on the ski injury, impacts on the Great Barrier Reef. And the more we regulate transport and travel, the more Australia is going to see declines in tourism. So already we've had concerns in Australia that the more Europe regulates emissions from aviation, the more expensive it becomes to fly, and the more people sit and say, well, should we fly all the way to Australia and pay whatever the carbon tax is on our emissions, or perhaps we should travel somewhere more local. Agricultural impacts. Most of this you would know. I think the most interesting thing is the sort of second last one from the bottom, sensitivity of plants to temperature increases. So we're seeing grape varieties and peanut varieties shifting across Australia, where we're having grapes planted and doing successfully in areas that previously were never able to produce good grape varieties, and that's all because we're seeing these shifts in temperatures around Australia. And again, heat waves, storms, flooding, those will all have impacts on the agricultural industry. So the question always comes, knowing what we know and knowing what we've been through, who should pay for the costs of climate change? And the difficulty is that even now, whenever you talk about imposing a cost on climate change, whenever you talk to electricity providers, the question always becomes, well, should they then pass the cost on to everyday Australians? It's usually a picture like this, these people doing it tough and so on. But of course, it's also these people in the image who are using the electricity, using the water, you know, buying the clothes that need the raw materials, buying the new cars and driving them, and so on and so forth. And so, you know, it's an important question to ask. But again, the Australian government does tend to get a little bit caught up in this idea of isolating certain groups from being exposed to the costs of responding to climate change. So trying to protect our key emissions-intensive industries, trying to protect people from the price signal. And if you're going to use a market mechanism to change emissions, then you need to expose people to the price signal that comes from putting a price on emissions. So it's a tricky one. You either pass on the cost and use a price signal, or you use a different measure. So what started all of this discussion about the need to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions? Well, it all came from the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and that had this overarching objective of stabilising greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Now, at the time, the parties didn't agree what dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system meant, but the EU was quite forceful in trying to tell people afterwards that it should be about 2 degrees. So if we could avoid an increase of 2 degrees Celsius, then we would be preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. But it was generally accepted that that wasn't in the treaty anywhere, and it was just something that the EU was using as its own goal. The definition of what the adverse effects of climate change were was they used this idea of significant deleterious effects on the composition, resilience, or productivity of natural and managed ecosystems, or on the operation of socio-economic systems or human health and welfare. So it was quite a broad concept, looking at the impacts on everything, both human, socio-economic, and environmental. So we had this wonderful broad overarching goal, and then the Kyoto Protocol came along in 1997. And the Kyoto Protocol said, well, let's stop stuffing around with these broad ideas of dangerous anthropogenic climate change. Let's just give everyone a strict target and ask them to stick to it. And so everyone was given a specific emission reduction target, and it varied depending on the country, and it was based on the reported 1990 greenhouse gas emissions. And they said, okay, from 2008 to 2012, you're going to commit to reduce your emissions in such a way so that you meet your emission reduction target. So it followed this idea of the polluter pays principle. So in terms of all of their national emissions, all their emissions within their own country, they would meet this target. But what it didn't do was tell them how they had to meet the target. So it didn't say you must reduce your domestic emissions. It didn't say you must change your energy use, or you must change the way in which you generate electricity. It left all of that up to the individual country to work out what they wanted to do. And we then had this amendment to the Kyoto Protocol in 2012, which said, okay, we're going to have a second commitment period that would take place. Okay, so it began in 2013, it was going to go through to 2020, and so it was going to allow the Kyoto Protocol to continue while all the parties negotiated a further agreement. Everyone knew there was going to eventually be a new international climate change agreement because the Kyoto Protocol had been heavily criticised, but they just needed something to tie them over until the new agreement came into effect. So they agreed on a second commitment period for the Kyoto Protocol called the Doha Amendment. It hasn't entered into force, though, so it doesn't have legal effect because not enough countries have ratified it. Australia has. It did that in November last year, but not enough people have done it. So the second commitment period's there, but it's not yet in force. One of the great strengths of the Kyoto Protocol, and also the reason why it's so heavily criticised, is it has these things known as flexibility mechanisms. And these flexibility mechanisms are the reason why I left my law firm in Sydney and came to Brisbane to do a full-time PhD looking at climate change, because I sat in this meeting listening to someone talk about this idea of flexibly meeting an emission reduction target, and it sounded so outrageous that I thought, well, I need to go and look at this more closely. So the idea is you have an overall target that says, yes, I will reduce my emissions. But then you have a number of ways that you can do that. So one of the things that you can do is Australia can go over to a developing nation and they can decide to plant trees or introduce a hydroelectric plant or do some sort of project using Australian funds. The project is then credited, and it generates carbon credits that then go back to Australia, and Australia can hand that in to the regulator at an international level and say, count that towards our target. Then they can use the joint implementation mechanism, so they can tie up with another country like New Zealand or someone else who's not a developing nation and say, let's do a project together. Let's put in place some wind farms or plant some trees or whatever it is. We'll generate some credits and share them between us, and we'll go and hand those into the regulator, and that will count towards our target. And then the other thing they can do is they can go and look for a country that's got spare credits going because they've actually changed their emissions profile and reduced their greenhouse gas emissions, and buy their credits and go to the regulator and hand them in and say, here you go, count that towards our target. So they're meant to be supplementary to initiatives to reduce your emissions domestically, but again, that's not defined. But even supplementarily, you could still be talking about at least 50% of emission reductions being just monopoly money, going and purchasing credits and then surrendering those and saying, well, here you go, without actually changing your emissions profile at a domestic level. So this is why the flexibility mechanisms have been criticised. The idea behind them was you were able to get emission reductions at the geographic location across the world where it was most cost effective to do so. So if it was cheaper to go to India or China or anything like that and reduce emissions there and then buy the credits for Australia, then Australia would have the economic choice to do that. So that was the reasoning behind it. But the difficulty is that it hasn't resulted, certainly from an Australian point of view, it wasn't a big motivator behind Australia reducing its domestic emissions. I won't go into this, it's just how emissions trading operates. I've talked to you a bit about the CDM and the JI. One of the things that you have to remember with CDM and JI projects, so these are the ones we're just talking about here, so Clean Development Mechanism and Joint Implementation, they're called CDM and JI. The projects that they put in place are meant to be additional to business as usual. So you can't already have a wind farm over there and then go in and say, oh, look, Australia's here to help, and then, take the credits. It has to be something that wasn't going to happen unless Australia went and invested in that project, and that's called additionality. So it's got to be additional to business as usual. And this is one of the biggest question marks around any crediting mechanism that we have, including the one we have in Australia at the moment. So we have an emission reductions fund in Australia that does something very similar. So you go and plant trees, and then you go to the regulator and they give you credits for it. And the big question is it additional? Is it actually resulting in emission reductions that wouldn't have been there without the crediting mechanism? And it's very difficult to answer with any certainty that the answer is yes. That's the real difficulty with these. And so that's what we're seeing with the CDM and the JI projects. And there's just a huge amount of money tied up in getting these things approved. So getting them to comply with methodologies, great deal of red tape, a lot of host country approvals plus international approvals under the UN Framework Convention, and it's expensive. And then there's this question mark around whether the credits that are handed out at the end actually represent a real reduction in emissions. So this is just a graphic way of describing what happens. So you're allocated your Kyoto Protocol units at the beginning of the commitment period. So those units represent your target for the commitment period. And then you have a choice. You can reduce your emissions and then trade your spare credits on the market, or you can go off and generate more credits using the flexibility mechanisms. And so you've got a choice how you play the game. And then the idea is everybody has a price signal, which is meant to give them an incentive to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So what's changed more recently is we've got the Paris Agreement, which was agreed in 2015. Australia signed it in April 2016, and then they ratified it in November last year. They ratified it in response to the Trump government being announced, and so they did two things at the same time. They ratified the Paris Agreement and they ratified the Doha Amendment. So there was enough parties have ratified it that it's come into force, so it has legal effect. And Article 2 is the key component that you need to know in the Paris Agreement. So it says that the Paris Agreement aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty, including by, and A is the key one here, holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. And then they go on to talk about the need to adapt to climate change. So the agreement deals with both mitigation, so reductions, and adaptation. So this is the first time that we had seen these international agreements putting that specific number on what is it that we're trying to achieve. So they've agreed that they want to hold greenhouse gas emissions to well below 2 degrees Celsius, pursuing efforts to limit the temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's an absolutely fabulous ambition. There is absolutely no doubt that Article 2 is just brilliant. The difficulty is that the rest of the Paris Agreement doesn't allow that 2 degree or that 1.5 degrees Celsius to be achieved. So each country voluntarily says what their commitment is going to be, and people have added up those commitments and worked out that there is absolutely no way we are going to hold increases in global average temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius. So the parties are not committing enough to allow us to meet the 2 degrees Celsius, and the Paris Agreement is quite a soft approach compared to the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol was very rigid. It said, here is your target. You will comply with this target. If you don't comply with the target, you will be penalized. There will be consequences. There's none of that in this. So they needed to get as many people to sign it as possible. They needed developed and developing nations to both agree to reduce emissions, and they achieved that. But they did it at a cost, and the cost was that it's very much based on good faith, and it's based on naming and shaming. So you hand in your national commitment. Here is my national commitment. This is what we're going to reduce emissions by. And then every 5 years, each country is meant to put in a more challenging and more ambitious emission reduction commitment. And this is where Australia is going to be very challenged, because the commitment they've put in for now, they're pretty sure they can meet. But they're not planning on any deeper cuts. They won't announce what they are. And in fact, a recent technical review by the United Nations queried their lack of transparency and their lack of accuracy in the reports that they're sending to the UN about their greenhouse gas emission reductions, because the UN cannot see from the material they're giving them how they are going to meet these targets that they're saying that they're going to meet. And so that's going to be very interesting. So they're almost being called out on the fact that they need more detail and more ambition in their long-term emission reduction targets. Article 4 is also going to be a huge challenge for Australia. This is actually an absolute killer, because it says, in order to achieve the long-term temperature goal set out in Article 2, that the parties will aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, and to undertake rapid reductions thereafter. And this is the important part, so as to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. What that means in plain English is that the parties have all agreed that by 2050, what goes out will be balanced by what comes in. So whatever they emit will be balanced by whatever is absorbed by the seas and the oceans and the soils. So we will be carbon neutral by 2050. Carbon neutral by 2050. Now, you've heard me talking over the past few weeks about Australia's focus on being an emissions-intensive economy. We want to continue to use and access our fossil fuels, our gas reserves. We can't do that and meet this obligation to be carbon neutral by 2050. Okay? Not unless we see dramatic differences in the uptake of carbon capture and storage. So that's where you capture the greenhouse gas emissions at their point of emission and you literally store them underground and you cap the top. And that's another area that I'm doing a lot of legal research into. But Australia is going to be really challenged by this. Carbon neutral by 2050. So if you just look at the third column here, what's Australia saying it's going to do? It's saying that it's going to meet its 2030 target, which is going to be a reduction of 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030. Why did it choose 2005? Because that was when Australia's emissions peaked. So it didn't choose 1990, it didn't choose any other year, it chose the year where we had our highest emissions, so it would make the drop of 28% look the most impressive, okay? It wasn't what the Garno Climate Change Review told them to do, it wasn't what the Climate Change Authority recommended they do, it certainly wasn't what the IPCC recommended they do. So it's considered to be a fairly unimpressive target at this point. And what's interesting is the Australian government recently announced a review of their climate change policies. But in the review, they say that they will easily meet their 26 to 28% target and that they're not intending to change their policy approach. So it's the strangest review of policy I've ever seen, where they've already said up front that they think that their policies are really good and don't need changing. And they're going to do it through the direct action plan, which when the current government was in opposition, they talked about this idea that we could rely on Australia's ample sun and soil to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions without any significant cost. And they then, when they came into power, turned it into their direct action plan, which, you know, just shows me, because I laughed my face off when I saw their sun and soil plan. It just can't be done. You can't physically buy that much mitigation, but they're trying, and they're not going to make it work, but they're still saying that they will. So they're using an emission reduction fund which purchases mitigation from the agricultural industry, so using soil, using plants, using forestry, pay these people to plant the trees and use their soil mitigation measures, and then they're going to use that to reduce Australia's emissions. It's just not enough. They just won't get the deep cuts that they need, and they don't have enough of funds allocated to it for it to work. The UN is pretty sceptical of what's going on here. They're calling for consistent climate policy from Australia, saying that we're sending mixed messages across the various governments. Some want to reduce emissions, some want a carbon tax, some don't want a carbon tax. You know, we had a temporary carbon tax and then that got revoked and so on and so forth. And then the UN has pointed out that, you know, some nice clear messages would be nice. And the Finkel report has pointed out, so the Finkel report is due to come out in the next few months, but the draft report said Australia is not on track to meet the climate change targets under the Paris Agreement. And I think that's fairly well established that as it currently stands, it's just not possible for the direct action plan to achieve that. So the Energy White Paper is really one of the examples of why we have the predicament that we do in Australia. So it said Australia has a wealth of energy resources, which is the basis of Australia's growing stature as a global energy superpower. Australian energy products and services must be delivered to households, business and international markets reliably and cost effectively, so Australia can take full advantage of these natural endowments. And that's the philosophy that we're still continuing to see, is this idea that we need to make the most of these fossil fuels. So the EMF, the Emission Reduction Fund, is the primary measure. And you would have seen from what I'm talking about today that it's just not going to be on its own significant enough or deep enough to achieve those targets that we need under the Paris Agreement. What we're not seeing is any changes to environmental protection approaches, to planning regimes and EIA processes, and we're not seeing any changes to liability mechanisms for addressing the harm that's going to be caused by climate change. And one of the things that I often say in my research that I publish is the fact that what we need is complementary measures that are all going to work together. You can't just have a market mechanism on its own. It needs to have those complementary measures to support it. One of the critical things that you need to be aware of from this lecture is the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act. It's how we account for greenhouse gas emissions, and it's how we report back to the UN on what our emissions are in Australia. So you can have a look at the Clean Energy Regulator if you want to have a look at this in more detail, but you need to have a general understanding that there's a set of greenhouse gases that we have to report under the Kyoto Protocol. So that's carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. And rather than us just giving the actual emissions for each of those individual gases, what we do is we have a basket approach. So we put them all into a basket and we report on them from the point of view of carbon dioxide equivalences. So those different greenhouse gases have different effects over different timescales, and in order to get around that and make the accounting more straightforward, we have this idea of, we talk about tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and this allows all emissions of greenhouse gases to be compared in a single unit. So this is what it looks like when we start using that CO2 equivalent. It means that you can do that comparison across sectors that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do if you were breaking it down to perfluorocarbons and methane and so on. So the reporting thresholds for the UNGAS Act, it's only for the big emitters across Australia. So if they emit 50,000 tonnes per more of carbon dioxide equivalent, or they produce 200 terajoules or more of energy, or they consume 200 terajoules or more of energy, then they're going to have these reporting requirements that are imposed on them. And you don't need to know this in any detail, you just need to know that the UNGAS Act has a set of methods that are followed in calculating what the emissions are. This is what you do need to understand. This is the idea of Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. So your Scope 1 emissions are the things that directly occur on the site. Your Scope 2 emissions are the emissions that occur from the electricity that's generated for you, that you consume on site. So the electricity is generated elsewhere, but you're consuming it. And the UNGAS Act only requires Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions to be reported. So the UNGAS Act only requires direct emissions on site and emissions from off-site electricity generation to be reported. So that's Scope 1 and Scope 2. And then Scope 3 emissions are the downstream emissions. So when we talk about the coal that is pulled out of the ground and it's transported overseas and then it's burnt, and the emissions go up into the atmosphere, that would be a Scope 3 emission. And that's something that isn't reported under the UNGAS Act. So what sort of difficulties is Australia going to face if it continues down the path that it's going? Well, we're looking at breaches of international law, and there's this thing known as state responsibility for transboundary harm. So if you do an activity in your country, your state boundary, that has an impact in someone else's country, then you can be taken to court, to the international court, and sued, and you have to pay damages for the harm caused. So and this has been used where, there's been pollution events where oil has spilled into downstream rivers and it's gone from one country into another, and it's impacted their fisheries and it's impacted their environment, caused them harm. But equally, it could be taken to apply to greenhouse gas emissions, where one country has continued to emit in the face of knowledge that greenhouse gas emissions can cause harm. Yep. Well, they can be required to pay the damages.
How do you make a country pay another country damages?
So they have to comply. So they would. That's a very complicated question you've asked me, and you could do the companion course to this unit if you really like it. So there's another course that goes with this that looks purely at international environmental law, and you'll look at it in more detail there. But to give you a very basic answer, you accept the jurisdiction of the court when you appear before it, and by doing that you agree to accept whatever the consequences are that the court decides to impose on you. So that's how it works. But you can look at it when if you're keen on that sort of stuff, do the other course, because we look at it in a lot more detail. So liabilities under domestic law. We've talked about this across the course of the semester, about how the way our laws are currently drafted, there's no reason why the Queensland Environmental Protection Act or the Commonwealth EPBC Act, there's no reason why they can't be used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions now. Okay? There's nothing in the drafting to prevent that. It just comes down to policy decisions, and it comes down to a certain level of influence in terms of economic impacts. So, for example, the scope of the Queensland laws, we have a duty not to harm the environment. We've looked at those offence provisions together. Environmental harm is any adverse effect or potential adverse effect on an environmental value that may be caused directly or indirectly or as a result of the activity, either alone or in combination with any other effects. So that definition of environmental harm, that expands to climate change, adverse climate change. So the way that these laws are drafted, they very clearly can be interpreted to include greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, the definition of contaminants in the Environmental Protection Act, it says gases. Greenhouse gases are a gas, so they could be regulated as contaminants under the Environmental Protection Act. This is not a radical thing. This really is not. The US is like light years ahead of us, and there was a case, Massachusetts versus the EPA, where the EPA was sued for not regulating greenhouse gas emissions as an air pollution agent under the US Clean Air Act. So it's happened in other countries as well. Same sort of thing with our environmental planning laws. The EPBC Act can fairly comfortably apply to adverse climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. The issue is how we start applying the package of principles of ESD and the precautionary principle, the principle of intergenerational equity, when we start also including the social and the economic impacts and benefits of allowing these projects to proceed. And that's when it starts muddying the waters in terms of these decisions. So technically there's no need for new laws in order to incorporate greenhouse gas emissions into that EIA process. So in the time that we've got left, I just wanted to go through a few of the cases with you. I won't spend too long on them. I just want to give you a feeling for what our courts are doing in terms of dealing with climate change, because this is a very, very new and challenging concept for them as well. And the one that started it all off was Walker versus the Minister for Planning. So this was a New South Wales decision. And they found there that the minister had an implied obligation to consider whether climate change was relevant and to take that into consideration when deciding whether or not to approve something under the Planning Act. The EIS didn't refer to climate change, and the court held that the minister had failed to consider the principles of ESD, and particularly had failed to consider the public interest, which is one of the factors of ESD, by failing to consider the climate change risk when he decided whether or not to approve the project, which was very, very interesting. And the court did that by looking at the scope and the purpose of the New South Wales Environmental Protection Act. And you've heard me say a few times this semester how important it is to be aware of what the scope and purpose of the Act is. And this is why, because the rest of the Act is interpreted against the scope and the purpose of the Act. The Australian Conservation Foundation brought a case against Latrobe City Council. So this was in Victoria, and this was all to do with the Hazelwood Power Station. So there was an amendment to the planning scheme which was going to allow the power station to continue to operate for a further term. And the terms of reference that they set for the panel, it was an independent panel, but the terms of reference expressly stated that the panel was not to consider matters related to greenhouse gas emissions from the power station, which meant that when the environmental effects statement came in, which is what they're called in Victoria, there was no reference to greenhouse gas emissions in it, even though this was all about extending the life of a coal-based power station. And any public submissions that were made to the panel that referred to greenhouse gas emissions were held to be null and void and were not considered by the panel when it made its decision. And it was challenged by the ACF, and they held that the terms of reference were void because the Act required the panel to consider all relevant submissions, including submissions about indirect effects from the amendment. And what they said was amending the approval to allow the mine to continue, so it extended the life of the power station, which would make it more probable that the atmosphere would receive greater greenhouse gas emissions than would otherwise be the case, and that this may be an environmental effect of significance. So, you know, to us that's a no-brainer, but at the time that was like, wow, the court has actually required them to consider greenhouse gas emissions. Coastal adaptation is another area that's really challenging regulators and the courts. We're seeing a very fragmented and ad hoc approach. Or questions of what sea level benchmarks do we use, who should have the power to restrict or prohibit development, and a lot of local resistance when there are protective measures put in place. We have examples where council have gone in and put in seawalls and erosion control devices and then been sued for putting them in. And we have examples where councils have not put in seawalls and erosion control devices and have been sued for not putting them in. And so we now have legislation across Australia protecting local councils from being sued for any decisions or actions that they make in good faith relating to climate change. One of the things that a lot of councils are considering is this idea of time-limited development approvals. So, you know, you can build here for the next 10 years or whatever the date is, but after that date, you no longer have a valid development approval. You must leave the site. And then we're considering all sorts of things: bonds, incentives, subsidies, ways to encourage climate proofing. And certainly we find that existing buildings are much more challenging to address than new builds. At least with new builds, we can say, hey, build up, as we all know from the group assignment. But once you've got an existing building, it's much harder to require, to interfere with those existing property rights and require that owners change their practices on the site. Gray versus the Minister for Planning was a 2006 decision. This was the Anvil Hill coal mining project. And this was a case where the EIS for the project only looked at Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So it looked at the direct emissions from the project and the indirect emissions from the use of electricity. But the court said that that wasn't sufficient, that the Director General, again this was New South Wales, was legally bound to consider the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions from the downstream burning of coal by third parties from new coal mines. Okay, so this is what we've been talking about, this idea of considering what happens when the coal is burnt and the emissions go into the atmosphere. And in that case, in the New South Wales decision, the Director General was required to consider the Scope 3 emissions. And they said failure to take into account the principles of ESD and the principle of intergenerational equity and the precautionary principle meant that the EIS was deficient and that the EIS had to contain sufficient information to enable the Minister to consider all relevant matters to then decide whether or not the precautionary principle applied. And they went on to point out that the importance worldwide of climate change and global warming, and the mere fact that there are many contributors worldwide and does not in itself mean that the source of emissions from the Anvil Hill project should be ignored. So this is the opposite of what we've seen in decisions since. So they said just because the Anvil Hill project is only one contributor of many that we see globally does not mean that we should ignore the emissions that will come from this coal mine here in Australia. And I'll take you in a minute to these other ones, and they have very different decisions. This one's another 2006. We had a good run of cases in 2006. This was the Isaac Plains and the Sonoma projects. Again, common argument, burning of coal from the mine would impact on global warming, and then it would have an impact on matters of national environmental significance. And the minister said, no, it's not a controlled action, I don't need to consider it. And what the minister said in his decision was that, look, the nature of induced climate change from the coal mine and the impacts on World Heritage values are speculative. I regard the likelihood of significant impacts on matters of national environmental significance arising from the marginal addition of greenhouse gas emissions to be extremely small, in addition to speculative. And this is pretty much the sort of pattern that we see. So we now see the Commonwealth ministers, they consider greenhouse gas emissions, but they form a very similar conclusion every time. These emissions are small, they're speculative, they're insignificant, and therefore there's no need to mitigate them. And then it's the same decision that was upheld by the court. They said, yep, I'm far from satisfied that the burning of coal at some identified place in the world, the production of greenhouse gases from such combustion, its contribution towards global warming, the impact of global warming upon a protected matter can be so described. So they're just like, it's speculative, it hasn't been proved, and there's no need to consider it. It says the applicant's case is really based upon the assertion that greenhouse gas emission is bad and that the Australian government should do whatever it can to stop it, including, one assumes, banning new coal mines in Australia. This was the court saying this. So they really were not at all supportive of the applicant's arguments. Very close to the end. I just wanted to take you through the last two cases that we've seen. So this one is the Alpha coal mine. You know, the one where I was like, yippee, it's going to have a special leave application to the High Court. Well, the special leave application was unsuccessful, so we're stuck with these sort of decisions. So this was a proposed mine by Hancock Coal in the Galilee Basin. Similar argument was brought, okay? So we need to consider Scope 3 emissions, downstream burning of coal, and the impact on the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area from climate change impacts. And this is what the court said. They said, I can sympathise with the position of the objectors who see greenhouse gas emissions rising and the likely adverse climate change consequences that will flow should nothing be done to alter the course that the world is heading down. I have no reason to doubt the eminent expert evidence that was presented in this case to that effect. However, I must, on the evidence of this case, determine that it is the demand for coal-fired electricity and not the supply of coal from coal mines which is at the heart of the problem. Okay, do you understand what they're saying there? So it's because people want to buy coal to have coal-fired electricity that we have climate change, okay? It's not because Australia is mining coal and exporting it overseas. It says, clearly the possibility of dire consequences from climate change is a matter which falls to be addressed by the international community and the federal government. Even if it were within the jurisdiction of the court, which apart from public interest principles I found it not to be, then the clear and unambiguous facts of this case show that there will be no reduction of greenhouse gas emissions if the Alpha mine is refused, and indeed, depending on the source of replacement coal, such replacement coal may well, on the evidence, result in an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So what Hancock Coal had told the court, and their experts had told the court, was that if the Alpha coal mine did not go ahead, then the overseas electricity coal-fired power plants would source the coal from somewhere else. So the amount of coal burnt would never change. So the amount of coal burnt would stay the same It's just those coal-fired power plants would get their coal from somewhere else. They wouldn't get them from Hancock coal. And that would mean that they might not get the quality of coal that they were getting from Hancock coal. And they might end up burning a coal that was lesser quality and had more pollutants in it, and therefore would have a worse impact on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And the court agreed with them. And basically, when Chris McGrath talks about this, he pretty much calls it like the drug dealer defense. This idea that if you shut down one drug dealer, they'll just go find another one. I don't know if they stood up and said that in the special leave application in the High Court, but this was what they were trying to appeal. This is what they were hoping to get a decision on, and unfortunately that wasn't their day. And in case you thought that was a one-off and, you know, someone was just a bit loopy, unfortunately we have another decision that reached pretty much the same conclusion on the Adani coal case. So this is the 2016 Federal Court of Australia. And it says, while the proponent has identified a quantity of overseas greenhouse gas emissions that may result from burning the coal, these emissions are not a direct consequence of the proposed action. The actual quantity of emissions that is likely to be additional to current global greenhouse gas emissions depends on a range of variables. These include whether the coal replaces coal currently provided by other suppliers, whether the coal is currently used as a substitute for other energy sources, the efficiency of the coal-burning power plants, the international multilateral environment agreements, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, provide mechanisms to address climate change globally. Under these agreements, the nations responsible for burning the coal produced from the proposed mine would be expected to address the emissions from transport by rail, shipping and combustion of the product coal in their own countries. I found that direct and consequential greenhouse gas emissions associated with the project will be managed and mitigated through national and international emission control frameworks operating in Australia and within countries that are the import market for coal from the project. So they're saying, hey, we've got an international agreement on climate change, so we don't need to regulate Australia's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, which you've heard me talk today about what the Paris Agreement has. And I don't think any of you would walk away with an understanding that that's what the Paris Agreement is all about. It's not about reaching down domestically into a country and saying, hey, you can't use coal in your coal-fired power plants anymore. So it's a very misguided interpretation of what the international climate change agreements are trying to do. So what are the take-home points from this lecture today? The take-home points are that traditional regulation has an important role to play in addressing greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to climate change. The principles of ESD are designed to address cases like this, where there is scientific uncertainty and the threat of serious environmental harm. Politics can interfere with the role of decision makers, and we're going to discuss this more next week when we talk about professional duties and ethical dilemmas. At the end of the day, Australia is an emissions-intensive economy with a focus on exploiting all available fossil fuel deposits, and for our emissions to reduce, that needs to change. And in fact, I've just finished writing an article on, it's called A Legal Blueprint for Responding to the Paris Agreement, an Australian case study, and that's pretty much the conclusion I put in it, that if Australia is going to respond to the Paris Agreement in a way that meets its overall objectives and obligations, then that needs to change. We need to change the fact that we are an emissions-intensive economy. So have a look at these two questions I put up. They're the past paper questions, so they just identify what Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions are. Group assignments, you're going to be progressively getting your marks back next week. Don't worry if one of you gets an email before the others, so they'll just get sent out as the week goes on, and you're more than welcome to contact me if you want to discuss it. Feedback is coming in, so the surveys are opening next week. Really important to me that I get feedback on how this course has gone. I can't remember if I told you at the beginning, but I've only been employed to do this once. So if you think I've done a decent job, then I need the feedback to show that, so they bring me back on to teach the course again. So if people liked listening to the recordings at home, which I know some people have, then hey, give me the feedback for it. If you found the case studies interesting, then make a comment on that. If you found the screenshots helpful rather than trying to track down the legislation, then go ahead and give me some constructive feedback. And then, yeah, that's it. Any other questions, you can post them to the discussion board. Thanks for coming, guys. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I can't do that subject because, you know, major restrictions and stuff.
Ah.
Engineering. So.
Hang on, let me just press stop on the recording.